The dusty plains of medieval Iberia witnessed 7 centuries of intermittent warfare that would forge the character of an entire civilization. The Reconquista, stretching from the 8th to the 15th centuries, created more than just territorial gains for Christian kingdoms. It manufactured a particular type of warrior, a specific worldview, and institutions that would prove devastatingly effective when transplanted to the Americas. The men who would later terrorize Aztec emperors and Inca nobles learned their trade in the harsh borderlands between Christian and Muslim Spain, where survival depended on swift horses, sharp steel, and an unshakable belief in divine favor. Spanish warfare developed around mobility, rapid strikes, and the integration of diverse fighting techniques learned from both Christian and Muslim adversaries. The typical Spanish knight of the 15th century rode a sturdy Andalusian horse bred for endurance rather than the massive destriers favored in France or England. These horses, descendants of barb stock introduced by Muslim invaders, could cover vast distances across arid terrain while carrying a fully armored rider. Spanish military tactics emphasized the coordinated use of heavy cavalry, light cavalry, crossbowmen, and increasingly arquebuses. The religious dimension of the Reconquista permeated every aspect of Spanish military culture. Warriors saw themselves as soldiers of Christ engaged in holy war against Islam. This crusading mentality received official sanction from the papacy, which granted the same spiritual benefits to those fighting in Spain as to crusaders in the Holy Land. The military orders, Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, embodied this fusion of martial prowess and religious devotion. These organizations accumulated vast landholdings in conquered territories, creating a model for the later distribution of encomiendas in the New World. The economic structures that developed during the Reconquista created both the incentives and mechanisms for overseas expansion. As Christian armies conquered Muslim territories, they faced the problem of governing and exploiting lands with predominantly non-Christian populations. The solution involved granting conquered territories to nobles, military orders, and municipalities who then assumed responsibility for defense, settlement, and conversion of the inhabitants. This system, known as repartimiento, distributed land, buildings, and sometimes even people among the conquerors according to their contributions to the conquest. The encomienda system that would later devastate indigenous populations in the Americas had clear precedents in medieval Spain. Christian lords received grants of Muslim peasants along with their lands, creating relationships that combined elements of feudalism with more exploitative arrangements. These mudéjar, as Muslim subjects of Christian rulers were known, owed labor service, tribute, and agricultural products to their new lords. The legal framework developed to govern these relationships would be adapted and expanded in the New World, where Spanish colonists would claim similar rights over indigenous peoples. The Hidalgo class, Spain's lower nobility, emerged as the primary driving force behind the conquest of the Americas. These men possessed noble status, but often lacked substantial wealth or extensive landholdings. The word Hidalgo itself, derived from hijo de algo, or son of something, reflected their intermediate position in Spanish society. They enjoyed certain legal privileges, including exemption from taxation and the right to bear arms, but many struggled economically in a society where manual labor was considered beneath their station. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492 eliminated traditional opportunities for military advancement and territorial gain within Spain, forcing ambitious hidalgos to look elsewhere for fortune and glory. But where would they find their next battlefield? The answer lay across an ocean they had barely begun to explore. The technological advantages developed during the Reconquista proved decisive in the conquest of the Americas. Spanish metalworking, refined through centuries of warfare, produced steel weapons of exceptional quality. Toledo steel became legendary throughout Europe for its hardness and flexibility, qualities achieved through techniques learned from Muslim craftsmen. Spanish swords, particularly the espada and later the rapier, combined cutting and thrusting capabilities in weapons that were both deadly and durable. These steel weapons gave Spanish conquistadors an enormous advantage over indigenous warriors armed with obsidian clubs and copper implements. Spanish cavalry tactics developed in the open plains of Castile and perfected in the mountains of Granada proved devastatingly effective against indigenous armies that had never encountered mounted warfare. The Spanish war horse itself became a weapon of terror. These animals, standing 14 to 15 hands high and weighing 800 to 1,000 pounds, could trample infantry formations while their riders struck down fleeing enemies with lance and sword. The psychological impact of cavalry charges on foot soldiers who had never seen horses cannot be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe indigenous warriors fleeing in panic at the mere sight of mounted Spaniards. The crossbow, a weapon that had reached its technological peak in Spain, provided Spanish forces with devastating ranged firepower. Spanish crossbows could penetrate indigenous armor and shields at ranges up to 200 yards, allowing small groups of conquistadors to break up large enemy formations before they could close to hand-to-hand combat range. The crossbow's mechanical advantage meant that relatively untrained soldiers could achieve accuracy that would require years to develop with traditional bows. Spanish crossbowmen could maintain a steady rate of fire that devastated enemy morale and disrupted their battle formations. The introduction of firearms to Spanish armies during the final phases of the Reconquista provided conquistadors with their most feared weapon, the arquebus, a matchlock firearm that appeared in Spanish service during the 1470s, could penetrate any armor worn by indigenous warriors and produced a thunderous noise that terrified both men and animals. Early arquebuses were cumbersome weapons that required a forked rest for accurate shooting and took considerable time to reload, but their psychological impact far exceeded their practical effectiveness. The sound of gunfire, the smoke, and the devastating wounds inflicted by lead bullets convinced many indigenous peoples that the Spanish possessed supernatural powers. Spanish military engineers developed siege techniques during the Reconquista that would prove valuable in the conquest of indigenous cities. The siege of Granada, which lasted from 1482 to 1492, demonstrated Spanish mastery of artillery, mining, and blockade tactics. Spanish forces learned to coordinate the use of cannons, crossbows, and arquebuses in siege operations, creating combined arms techniques that could reduce fortified positions with minimal Spanish casualties. These skills would prove crucial in the conquest of cities like Tenochtitlan and Cusco, where indigenous defenders had strong fortifications but lacked effective countermeasures against European siegecraft. The religious justifications for conquest that would later legitimize Spanish actions in the Americas were thoroughly developed during the Reconquista. Christian theologians and legal scholars created an extensive body of doctrine that justified warfare against non-Christians and the seizure of their lands and property. The concept of just war allowed Spanish kings to claim divine sanction for their military campaigns while promising spiritual rewards to those who participated in the fighting. This theological framework would be seamlessly transferred to the New World, where Spanish conquistadors would claim the same divine mandate to conquer and convert indigenous peoples. The institutional structures created during the Reconquista provided the administrative framework for Spanish colonial government. The Spanish crown developed sophisticated bureaucratic procedures for governing newly conquered territories, managing diverse populations, and extracting maximum economic benefit from territorial expansion. These institutions would be replicated in the New World as the basis for colonial administration that would oversee Spanish rule for more than 3 centuries. The legal codes developed to govern Christian-Muslim relations in medieval Spain would be adapted to regulate Spanish indigenous relations in the Americas. But first, someone had to discover these new lands, and that man would be a Genoese navigator with an audacious plan. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator in Spanish service, made landfall in the Caribbean on October 12, 1492. The man who had inadvertently opened the Americas to Spanish conquest possessed neither the noble birth nor military experience of the typical conquistador, yet his voyages established the patterns of exploration, exploitation, and indigenous subjugation that would define Spanish colonialism for centuries. Columbus approached the New World with the same assumptions that had governed Christian-Muslim relations in medieval Spain. Non-Christians occupied their lands illegitimately, their wealth existed for Christian taking, and their souls required salvation through forced conversion. Columbus's first voyage departed from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492, with 3 vessels carrying approximately 90 men. The flagship Santa Maria, a now of about 100 tons, accompanied 2 smaller caravels, the Pinta and the Niña, each displacing roughly 50 tons. These ships represented the pinnacle of 15th-century Spanish maritime technology, combining Mediterranean hull designs with Atlantic rigging innovations. The expedition carried crossbows, swords, arquebuses, and a small cannon, reflecting Columbus's expectation that he might encounter hostile populations in the lands he hoped to reach. After 36 days at sea, the expedition sighted land at what Columbus named San Salvador, likely present-day Watling Island in the Bahamas. The indigenous inhabitants Columbus encountered belonged to the Taíno people, who had developed a sophisticated agricultural society based on cassava cultivation, fishing, and inter-island trade. The Taíno lived in settlements ranging from small villages to substantial towns of several thousand inhabitants governed by caciques who exercised authority over multiple communities. Their technology included sophisticated pottery, cotton textiles, and wooden implements, though they lacked metal tools, wheeled vehicles, and domesticated animals other than dogs. Columbus's initial observations of the Taíno reveal both his commercial instincts and his cultural prejudices. He noted their physical appearance in detail. They were well-proportioned people with copper-colored skin, straight black hair, and no facial hair. Many painted their bodies with various pigments and wore gold ornaments in their noses and ears, which immediately captured Columbus's attention. The Taíno went naked or wore minimal clothing, which Columbus interpreted as evidence of their primitive nature, failing to recognize that this represented a rational adaptation to tropical climate. The Taíno social structure, based on kinship networks and reciprocal obligations, differed fundamentally from European concepts of property and authority. Taíno caciques exercised leadership through consensus and ritual authority rather than coercive power, and land belonged to communities rather than individuals. These differences would prove catastrophic when Spanish colonists attempted to impose European legal and economic systems on Taíno society. The Taíno practice of offering gifts to visitors, which Columbus interpreted as submission, actually represented a diplomatic protocol designed to establish peaceful relationships between communities. Columbus's second voyage, launched in 1493 with 17 ships and approximately 1,200 men, transformed Spanish presence in the Caribbean from exploration to colonization. This expedition included soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and livestock, indicating Spanish intentions to establish permanent settlements. The expedition also carried the first missionaries to the New World, Franciscan and Benedictine friars tasked with converting indigenous populations. The colonists established their first permanent settlement at La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola in December 1493. Columbus's administration of La Isabela revealed his inexperience in colonial governance and his increasingly desperate attempts to satisfy Spanish expectations for profitable returns. He organized expeditions into Hispaniola's interior, searching for gold deposits and forcing indigenous communities to provide tribute in gold dust, cotton, or food. The Spanish introduced a system requiring every indigenous person over 14 years of age to deliver a specified quantity of gold every 3 months, with those unable to meet the quota forced to provide alternative tribute in agricultural products or labor. This tribute system represented the first systematic exploitation of indigenous populations in the Americas and established precedents that would be expanded throughout Spanish colonial territories. The nightmare was only beginning. The encomienda system emerged during these early years of colonization as Spanish administrators attempted to create a legal framework for indigenous exploitation that satisfied both colonist demands for labor and royal concerns about proper treatment of new subjects. The encomienda granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and religious instruction. This system drew directly on precedents established during the Reconquista, when Christian lords had been granted similar rights over Muslim populations. Columbus implemented the first encomiendas on Hispaniola around 1499, distributing indigenous communities among Spanish colonists according to their social status and contributions to the colony. Each encomendero received rights to tribute and labor from a specified number of indigenous families, creating a system that satisfied colonist demands for wealth while maintaining the fiction that indigenous peoples remained free subjects of the Spanish crown. The encomienda system would spread throughout Spanish America, becoming the primary mechanism for indigenous exploitation and the foundation of colonial society. The demographic catastrophe that befell Hispaniola's indigenous population during the first decades of Spanish colonization foreshadowed similar disasters throughout the Americas. The Taíno population of Hispaniola, estimated at between 400,000 and 1 million in 1492, had declined to fewer than 50,000 by 1508 and virtually disappeared by 1520. This demographic collapse resulted from multiple factors: epidemic diseases introduced by Europeans and their animals, the disruption of traditional food systems, forced labor in mines and plantations, and outright violence. European diseases proved particularly devastating to populations with no previous exposure to smallpox, typhus, measles, and influenza. The Spanish exploitation of Hispaniola's gold deposits required massive amounts of indigenous labor and introduced techniques that would be replicated throughout Spanish America. Spanish colonists forced indigenous workers to pan for gold in rivers and streams, work that required standing in water for hours while manipulating heavy equipment. The physical demands of this labor, combined with inadequate food and shelter, killed thousands of indigenous workers. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed between Spain and Portugal on June 7, 1494, established the legal framework for European colonization of the Americas and demonstrated how European powers divided the non-Christian world among themselves without regard for indigenous peoples. This treaty moved the line of demarcation established by Pope Alexander VI inter caetera Bull 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, effectively granting Spain exclusive rights to most of the Americas while reserving Brazil for Portugal. The treaty assumed that Christian monarchs possessed the authority to claim and distribute lands occupied by non-Christian peoples. The papal bulls that preceded and followed the Treaty of Tordesillas provided the theological justification for Spanish conquest and colonization. Pope Alexander VI inter caetera bulls of 1493 granted the Spanish monarchs dominion over all lands discovered west of a meridian 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, provided these lands were not already under Christian rule. The bulls explicitly charged the Spanish monarchs with converting indigenous populations to Christianity, creating a divine mandate that justified conquest as a religious duty. Columbus's fourth and final voyage, conducted from 1502 to 1504, explored the Central American coast while he searched unsuccessfully for a passage to Asia. By this time, other Spanish expeditions had begun exploring Caribbean islands and establishing new settlements, reducing Columbus's importance in Spanish colonial expansion. His death in 1506 marked the end of the discovery phase of Spanish colonization and the beginning of systematic conquest and exploitation of American territories. A new generation of conquistadors was rising, men who combined the military experience of the Reconquista with hard-won knowledge of American conditions, and they were ready to unleash hell itself upon the New World. Juan Ponce de León arrived in Puerto Rico in August 1508 with a force of 50 men, a modest expedition that belied the devastating impact it would have on the island's indigenous population. Ponce de León brought 15 years of Caribbean experience to this conquest, having participated in Columbus's second voyage and served as a colonial administrator on Hispaniola. The expedition included veteran soldiers armed with crossbows, arquebuses, and steel swords, along with war dogs trained to track and attack indigenous warriors. The Taíno inhabitants of Puerto Rico, known locally as Borinquen, numbered approximately 30,000 people, organized into numerous cacicazgos or chiefdoms scattered across the island. These communities had developed sophisticated agricultural systems based on conuco farming, which involved creating raised fields that maximized crop yields while preventing soil erosion. Their settlements ranged from small villages of a few hundred inhabitants to substantial towns of several thousand people connected by well-maintained trails that facilitated trade and communication. Ponce de León's initial strategy focused on establishing alliances with cooperative caciques while identifying and isolating potential sources of resistance. He understood that direct military confrontation with the entire Taíno population would be impossible with his limited forces, so he employed diplomatic techniques learned during the Reconquista, when Spanish commanders had successfully turned Muslim communities against each other. The conquistador established his base at Capara, strategically located near the island's northern coast, where Spanish ships could provide supplies and reinforcement. The Spanish conquest of Puerto Rico revealed the devastating effectiveness of European diseases as weapons of war. Within months of Ponce de León's arrival, smallpox and typhus began spreading through Taíno communities that had no previous exposure to these pathogens. Entire villages succumbed to disease, with mortality rates reaching 90% in some areas. The demographic catastrophe eliminated potential military resistance while creating a labor shortage that would plague Spanish colonization efforts. Spanish observers noted that indigenous communities abandoned their agricultural fields as families fled to remote mountain areas. The encomienda system established on Puerto Rico demonstrated how Spanish administrators had refined this institution based on their experience in Hispaniola. Ponce de León distributed indigenous communities among his followers according to a careful hierarchy that rewarded military service while ensuring adequate labor for gold mining and agricultural development. Each encomendero received rights to tribute and labor from a specified number of indigenous families, but the system now included more detailed regulations governing treatment of indigenous workers and requirements for religious instruction. Spanish mining operations on Puerto Rico employed techniques developed in medieval Spain and refined through Caribbean experience. Indigenous workers panned for gold in the island's rivers using wooden bateas, shallow pans that allowed them to separate gold particles from sand and gravel through careful manipulation. Spanish overseers forced indigenous laborers to work in shifts that maximized production while minimizing the number of Spanish personnel required for supervision. The physical demands of this work, combined with inadequate nutrition and exposure to diseases, killed thousands of indigenous workers within the first few years of Spanish occupation. Diego Velázquez's conquest of Cuba beginning in 1511 represented the culmination of Spanish Caribbean expansion and established the island as the launching point for mainland expeditions that would bring down the Aztec and Inca empires. Velázquez arrived with approximately 300 men and substantial resources provided by his experience as a colonial administrator on Hispaniola. His expedition included seasoned veterans of Caribbean conquest, skilled craftsmen, and livestock that would transform Cuban agriculture. Cuba was about to become the staging ground for the greatest conquests in human history. Cuba's indigenous population presented Velázquez with a more complex challenge than earlier Caribbean conquests. The island supported approximately 100,000 inhabitants organized into numerous independent chiefdoms, some of which had developed sophisticated political alliances and military capabilities. The western regions contained Taíno communities similar to those found on other Caribbean islands, while the eastern areas included groups that had migrated from South America and maintained distinct cultural practices. These populations had developed extensive trade networks that connected communities across hundreds of miles. Hatuey, a Taíno cacique who had fled from Hispaniola to Cuba, emerged as the primary leader of indigenous resistance to Spanish conquest. His experience with Spanish colonial rule on Hispaniola gave him unique insights into Spanish military capabilities and intentions, making him a formidable opponent who could organize effective resistance. Hatuey understood that Spanish forces depended on indigenous collaboration and supplies, so he implemented a strategy of denying these resources while conducting guerrilla warfare against isolated Spanish detachments. The Spanish response to Hatuey's resistance demonstrated their willingness to employ extreme violence to terrorize indigenous populations into submission. Velázquez organized systematic campaigns that burned indigenous villages, destroyed food supplies, and executed captured warriors in public displays designed to discourage further resistance. Spanish forces employed war dogs to hunt indigenous refugees in mountain hideouts, while cavalry units pursued fleeing families across the island's interior. These tactics succeeded in breaking indigenous resistance, but also contributed to the demographic collapse that would devastate Cuba's native population. The capture and execution of Hatuey in 1512 eliminated the most effective indigenous resistance leader while providing Spanish forces with a propaganda victory that encouraged other caciques to submit. Spanish accounts of Hatuey's death, which described his refusal to convert to Christianity even when offered the opportunity to avoid execution, became part of the black legend that would later be used to criticize Spanish colonial practices. However, contemporary Spanish sources reveal that Hatuey's execution was carefully planned to maximize its psychological impact on indigenous communities. Economic exploitation patterns established during the conquest of Cuba created the foundation for Spanish colonial society throughout the Americas. Spanish colonists implemented encomienda grants that distributed indigenous communities among conquistadors according to their military contributions and social status. These grants provided Spanish encomenderos with access to indigenous labor for gold mining, agricultural production, and personal service, creating wealth that attracted additional Spanish settlers to the island. The system also established racial hierarchies that placed Spanish colonists at the top of colonial society while relegating indigenous peoples to subordinate positions. The demographic catastrophe that befell Cuba's indigenous population paralleled similar disasters throughout Spanish America. Disease epidemics killed an estimated 90% of Cuba's native inhabitants within 2 decades of Spanish arrival, eliminating most indigenous resistance while creating severe labor shortages for Spanish economic activities. Spanish administrators responded to this crisis by importing enslaved Africans to replace indigenous workers, establishing the foundation for Caribbean slave societies that would persist for centuries. The transition from indigenous to African labor marked a crucial turning point in Spanish colonial development. Velázquez's administration of Cuba established institutional structures that would serve as models for Spanish colonial government throughout the Americas. He created municipal councils in Spanish settlements that exercised local authority while remaining subordinate to royal officials appointed by the Spanish crown. These institutions combined elements of medieval Spanish municipal government with adaptations necessary for colonial conditions, creating hybrid systems that balanced colonist autonomy with royal control. The Cuban colonial government also developed procedures for managing indigenous affairs, regulating trade, and coordinating military operations that would be replicated in subsequent Spanish conquests. Everything was ready. The stage was set. And in February 1519, a man named Hernán Cortés would change the world forever. By February 1519, when Hernán Cortés departed Cuba with 11 ships and approximately 630 men, Spanish conquistadors possessed more than 2 decades of experience in American warfare, indigenous diplomacy, and colonial administration. Yet the Aztec Empire that awaited them across the Gulf of Mexico represented a challenge of unprecedented scale and complexity. A sophisticated civilization controlling millions of subjects across territories that dwarfed the Caribbean islands where Spanish forces had perfected their methods of subjugation. Cortés himself embodied the evolution of the conquistador from the crude adventurers who had accompanied Columbus to the calculating military entrepreneurs who would topple American empires. Born around 1485 to a minor Hidalgo family in Medellin, Extremadura, he had arrived in Hispaniola in 1504 as a young man seeking the fortune that had eluded his family in Spain. His experience as a colonist, encomendero, and participant in the conquest of Cuba had taught him the essential skills of American conquest: the manipulation of indigenous political divisions, the coordination of Spanish military advantages, and the bureaucratic procedures necessary to legitimize territorial seizure under Spanish law. The expedition that departed from Cuba represented a significant escalation in Spanish ambitions and capabilities. Cortés commanded 16 horsemen mounted on Andalusian horses specifically selected for their endurance and combat effectiveness in tropical conditions. These animals, standing 14 to 15 hands high and weighing between 800 and 900 pounds, had been bred for generations to carry armored riders across difficult terrain while maintaining the speed and agility necessary for cavalry charges. The expedition also included 32 crossbowmen armed with steel prods capable of penetrating indigenous armor at ranges exceeding 200 yards. The Spanish force carried 10 bronze cannons of various calibers, including falconets firing 1-pound balls and larger pieces capable of breaching fortifications or breaking up massed infantry formations. These artillery pieces represented the most advanced military technology available to European armies and provided Spanish forces with siege capabilities that no indigenous American civilization could match. The expedition's weaponry also included hundreds of steel swords forged in Toledo, crossbow bolts with steel points, lead bullets for the arquebuses, and gunpowder manufactured according to formulas developed during the Italian Wars. Cortés's landing at Cozumel in February 1519 demonstrated his understanding that successful conquest required more than military superiority. It demanded intelligence gathering, indigenous collaboration, and careful preparation for the challenges ahead. During this period, Cortés encountered Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest who had survived shipwreck on the Yucatan coast 8 years earlier and learned to speak Maya languages fluently. Aguilar's linguistic skills would prove invaluable as an interpreter and cultural mediator during the initial phases of the conquest. The Spanish force proceeded along the Yucatan coast to Tabasco, where they encountered their first significant military resistance from Maya warriors determined to prevent Spanish penetration into their territory. The Battle of Chentla in March 1519 provided Cortés with an opportunity to demonstrate Spanish military capabilities while testing his forces against indigenous opponents who employed sophisticated tactical formations and numerical superiority. The Maya assembled approximately 12,000 warriors armed with obsidian-edged macuahuitl clubs, atlatl spear throwers, and cotton armor. Spanish cavalry proved devastatingly effective against Maya formations that had never encountered mounted warfare. The psychological impact of horses on indigenous warriors cannot be overstated. Contemporary accounts describe Maya fighters fleeing in terror at the sight of what they initially perceived as single creatures combining human and animal characteristics. Spanish horsemen exploited this advantage by conducting coordinated charges that shattered Maya battle lines, while Spanish crossbowmen and arquebusiers provided supporting fire from protected positions. The combination of cavalry mobility, steel weapons, and ranged firepower allowed 630 Spanish soldiers to defeat indigenous forces, outnumbering them nearly 20-1. The aftermath of the Battle of Centla revealed Cortés's sophisticated understanding of indigenous psychology and his ability to transform military victory into political advantage. The Maya caciques who submitted to Spanish authority offered gifts that included 20 young women, among them a bilingual speaker who would become known as Malinche, or Doña Marina, whose linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge would prove crucial to Spanish success. Everything was falling into place, but the greatest challenge still lay ahead. A vast empire ruled from a city built on a lake, where gold flowed like water and human hearts fed the gods. Malinche's background exemplified the complex political dynamics that Spanish conquistadors would exploit throughout their conquest of Mexico. Born into Nahua nobility, she had been sold into Maya slavery following political conflicts in her home region, giving her fluency in both Nahuatl and Maya languages. Her aristocratic birth provided her with detailed knowledge of Mesoamerican political protocols, religious practices, and social hierarchies that would enable her to serve as more than a simple interpreter. Spanish sources describe her as intelligent, articulate, and politically astute, qualities that made her an invaluable advisor during negotiations with indigenous leaders. The linguistic chain that connected Spanish commanders to indigenous populations through Malinche and Aguilar created unprecedented opportunities for cultural manipulation and political intelligence gathering. Cortés could communicate with Nahuatl-speaking peoples through Malinche, who translated their words into Maya for Aguilar, who then rendered them into Spanish. This cumbersome process, nevertheless, provided Spanish forces with access to indigenous political thinking, military planning, and cultural assumptions that previous conquistadors had never possessed. The Spanish expedition's arrival at Veracruz in April 1519 marked the beginning of systematic intelligence gathering about the Aztec Empire and the political opportunities that existed for Spanish exploitation. Cortés established a permanent settlement at Villa Rica de la Veracruz, demonstrating his intention to remain on the mainland regardless of Diego Velázquez's instructions to limit the expedition to exploration and trade. The founding of this municipality also provided legal justification for Cortés's subsequent actions, as Spanish law permitted municipal councils to elect their own officials and communicate directly with the crown, bypassing colonial governors who might oppose their activities. The Totonac peoples who controlled the Veracruz region provided Cortés with his first detailed intelligence about Aztec political structure and the widespread resentment that existed among tributary populations throughout the empire. Totonac leaders described the tribute system that required subject peoples to provide specified quantities of goods, labor, and human sacrificial victims to Tenochtitlan on regular schedules. They explained how Aztec tax collectors enforced these obligations through military threats, while Aztec garrisons prevented tributary rebellions through systematic intimidation and occasional punitive campaigns. The Spanish discovery of widespread anti-Aztec sentiment among tributary peoples revealed the fundamental weakness that would ultimately destroy the empire despite its apparent military strength and territorial extent. The Aztec system of hegemonic control relied on the cooperation of local elites who collected tribute and maintained order in exchange for recognition of their authority and protection from external enemies. This arrangement created numerous opportunities for Spanish manipulation, as tributary peoples viewed the conquistadors as potential allies against Aztec domination rather than as foreign invaders threatening indigenous independence. Cortés's decision to march inland toward Tenochtitlan demonstrated his understanding that Spanish success depended on maintaining military momentum while preventing Aztec forces from coordinating effective resistance. The route he chose passed through territories controlled by various indigenous groups, each presenting different challenges and opportunities for Spanish diplomacy and warfare. The Spanish force that departed Veracruz in August 1519 included several hundred Totonac warriors who served as porters, guides, and auxiliary troops, establishing a pattern of indigenous collaboration that would characterize the entire conquest. The march to Tlaxcala represented the crucial test of Spanish military capabilities against indigenous opponents who possessed detailed knowledge of Spanish weapons and tactics through intelligence networks that connected Mesoamerican communities across vast distances. The Tlaxcalans had maintained their independence against Aztec expansion for decades through superior military organization, strategic alliances, and defensive positions in mountainous terrain that favored their fighting techniques. Their warriors employed obsidian-edged weapons with devastating effectiveness, while their commanders understood sophisticated tactical concepts including feints, ambushes, and coordinated attacks by multiple formations. The battle for Tlaxcala would determine whether Spanish forces could survive against a determined and capable enemy, or whether their conquest would end before reaching the great city on the lake. The series of battles fought between Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces in September 1519 provided both sides with opportunities to evaluate their opponent's capabilities and develop countermeasures against unfamiliar fighting techniques. Tlaxcalan warriors initially attempted to overwhelm Spanish positions through massed infantry attacks that relied on numerical superiority and the psychological impact of war cries, drums, and colorful battle standards. These tactics proved ineffective against Spanish defensive formations that combined cavalry charges with crossbow volleys and artillery fire. But Tlaxcalan commanders quickly adapted their strategies to exploit Spanish weaknesses. Spanish cavalry faced significant challenges in the mountainous terrain around Tlaxcala, where narrow trails and rocky ground limited their mobility while exposing them to Tlaxcalan ambushes from elevated positions. Tlaxcalan warriors learned to target Spanish horses with obsidian-pointed spears and arrows, recognizing that dismounted Spanish soldiers were much more vulnerable to indigenous weapons. The Tlaxcalans also developed tactics for dealing with Spanish firearms, including the use of cotton mantles to absorb crossbow bolts and the coordination of rapid advances that closed the distance before Spanish soldiers could reload their weapons. The eventual alliance between Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces resulted from Cortés's diplomatic skills and the Tlaxcalans' pragmatic assessment of Spanish military potential against their Aztec enemies. Tlaxcalan leaders recognized that Spanish weapons and tactics could provide decisive advantages in their ongoing conflicts with Aztec tributary collection and military pressure. The alliance negotiations revealed the sophisticated political thinking of Mesoamerican leaders who understood the implications of European arrival and sought to position their communities advantageously in the changing political landscape. The Tlaxcalan alliance transformed Spanish military capabilities by providing them with thousands of indigenous warriors familiar with Mesoamerican warfare, detailed intelligence about Aztec military organization, and secure bases for operations in the Mexican highlands. Tlaxcalan warriors served as scouts, porters, and auxiliary troops, while their leaders provided strategic advice about Aztec political vulnerabilities and military weaknesses. The alliance also demonstrated to other tributary peoples that successful resistance to Aztec authority was possible with Spanish support, encouraging additional defections from the empire. The Spanish approach to Cholula in October 1519 revealed both the opportunities and dangers inherent in Mesoamerican political complexity. Cholula's rulers had submitted to Spanish authority while secretly coordinating with Aztec officials to organize an ambush that would eliminate the Spanish threat before it could reach Tenochtitlan. The plot involved allowing Spanish forces to enter the city peacefully before attacking them with overwhelming numbers of warriors concealed in buildings throughout the urban area. Malinche's role in discovering the Cholula conspiracy demonstrated her value as a cultural interpreter and intelligence gatherer. Her conversations with Cholulan women revealed details of the planned ambush, while her understanding of Mesoamerican political protocols allowed her to recognize the deception in official Cholulan statements. The information she provided enabled Cortés to organize a preemptive strike that eliminated the conspiracy while demonstrating Spanish awareness of indigenous machinations. The massacre that followed served as a warning to other communities contemplating resistance while reinforcing Spanish reputation for ruthless effectiveness. The Spanish arrival at Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and political manipulation that had transformed a small European expedition into a formidable military coalition, including thousands of indigenous allies. The causeway approach to the Aztec capital provided Cortés and his men with their first comprehensive view of the urban complexity they intended to conquer. Tenochtitlan covered approximately 5 square miles of reclaimed lakebed connected to the mainland by 3 major causeways, each controlled by fortified positions that could prevent enemy access to the city center. The urban landscape that confronted Spanish observers defied European concepts of city planning and architectural achievement. Tenochtitlan's population exceeded 200,000 inhabitants, making it larger than any European city except Paris and Constantinople. The city's canal system provided transportation and waste disposal while supporting intensive agricultural production in floating gardens that surrounded the urban core. Massive temple pyramids dominated the cityscape, their stepped profiles rising above residential districts. The Spanish had reached the heart of the Aztec world, but entering the city would prove far easier than leaving it alive. Moctezuma's decision to welcome Spanish forces into Tenochtitlan rather than defending the causeways reflected the complex political and religious considerations that influenced Aztec responses to European arrival. Aztec political theory emphasized the divine nature of legitimate authority and the importance of maintaining cosmic balance through proper ritual observances. Moctezuma's initial uncertainty about Spanish identity, whether they represented returning deities, foreign ambassadors, or military invaders, complicated his decision-making process and prevented decisive action during the crucial early phases of Spanish penetration. The Spanish occupation of the Axayacatl Palace provided them with a fortified position in the heart of Tenochtitlan, while demonstrating Moctezuma's continued cooperation with their presence in the city. The palace complex covered several acres and included residential quarters, administrative offices, storage facilities, and defensive walls that could protect Spanish forces against attack. Its location adjacent to the main temple precinct placed Spanish soldiers at the symbolic center of Aztec political and religious authority, a position that enhanced their psychological dominance while providing strategic advantages for future military operations. Cortés's capture of Moctezuma in November 1519 represented a calculated gamble that Spanish political control could be maintained through manipulation of indigenous governmental structures rather than direct military occupation. The seizure occurred during a carefully orchestrated meeting in which Spanish soldiers surrounded the emperor, while Cortés demanded his cooperation in maintaining order and preventing resistance to Spanish authority. The success of this audacious action depended on Aztec political traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of imperial authority and the catastrophic consequences of harming the emperor. The psychological impact of Moctezuma's captivity on Aztec political structure cannot be overstated. Aztec governmental theory held that the emperor served as the earthly representative of the gods and that his authority derived from divine mandate rather than human consent. His capture by foreign forces created a crisis of legitimacy that paralyzed Aztec decision-making while encouraging tributary peoples to question their obligations to the empire. Spanish manipulation of this situation demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of indigenous political psychology and their ability to exploit cultural assumptions for military advantage. The arrival of Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition in April 1520 created a crisis that threatened to destroy Spanish achievements in Mexico through internal conflict between competing Spanish factions. Narváez arrived with approximately 900 men and orders from Diego Velázquez to arrest Cortés and assume control of Mexican operations. The confrontation between these Spanish forces provided Aztec leaders with an opportunity to exploit European divisions while demonstrating that Spanish power was not monolithic or invincible. The crisis forced Cortés to divide his forces at the moment when unified Spanish control was most crucial. Cortés's victory over Narváez at Chempoala demonstrated his superior tactical skills and his ability to maintain indigenous support despite internal Spanish conflicts. The night attack that eliminated Narváez's expedition revealed Spanish mastery of European military techniques while providing Cortés with additional manpower and equipment for his Mexican operations. The integration of Narváez's soldiers into Cortés's force doubled Spanish strength at a crucial moment when Aztec resistance was beginning to crystallize around new leadership that rejected accommodation with European invaders. The massacre at the Templo Mayor during the Festival of Toxcatl in May 1520 marked the decisive breakdown of Spanish-Aztec cooperation and the beginning of systematic indigenous resistance to European occupation. Pedro de Alvarado's decision to attack Aztec nobles during religious ceremonies reflected Spanish fears of indigenous rebellion and their willingness to employ preemptive violence to maintain control. The massacre eliminated hundreds of Aztec political and religious leaders while demonstrating Spanish contempt for indigenous sacred practices and their determination to impose European authority through terror. The city erupted in fury. The causeways were cut, and the Spanish nightmare was about to begin, a night they would call La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The indigenous uprising that followed the Templo Mayor massacre revealed the depth of anti-Spanish sentiment that had developed during months of foreign occupation and the effectiveness of Aztec military organization when properly motivated and led. Aztec forces cut the causeways connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland while launching coordinated attacks against Spanish positions throughout the city. The siege that ensued demonstrated indigenous ability to adapt their tactics to Spanish weapons while exploiting their superior knowledge of local terrain and their overwhelming numerical advantages. The death of Moctezuma in June 1520 eliminated the primary mechanism through which Spanish forces had maintained political control over the Aztec Empire while providing indigenous resistance with powerful symbolic motivation. Whether Moctezuma died from stones thrown by his own people during Spanish attempts to use him to calm the uprising, or from wounds inflicted by Spanish soldiers who no longer found him useful, his death marked the end of indirect Spanish rule and the beginning of direct military confrontation between European and indigenous forces. The Spanish retreat from Tenochtitlan on June 30th, 1520, La Noche Triste, demonstrated both Spanish military vulnerabilities and their capacity for survival under extreme conditions. The nighttime evacuation across the Tacuba Causeway resulted in the death of approximately 400 Spanish soldiers and 4,000 indigenous allies, while Spanish survivors lost most of their artillery, horses, and treasure. The disaster revealed the limitations of Spanish military advantages in urban warfare against determined indigenous resistance, but Spanish ability to maintain unit cohesion during the retreat prevented complete annihilation of European forces in Mexico. The Spanish recovery during the summer and fall of 1520 demonstrated Cortés's strategic understanding and his ability to rebuild military capabilities through indigenous alliances and European reinforcements. The retreat to Tlaxcalan territory provided Spanish forces with secure bases for reorganization, while their indigenous allies supplied food, warriors, and intelligence about Aztec military preparations. Spanish control of the coastal regions enabled them to receive reinforcements and supplies from Cuba, while maintaining communication with Spanish authorities, who could provide legal and financial support for renewed military operations. The systematic reconstruction of Spanish military power following La Noche Triste demonstrated the resilience of conquistador forces and their capacity to transform tactical defeats into strategic victories through indigenous alliances and superior organizational skills. The siege of Tenochtitlan that began in May 1521 represented the culmination of Spanish preparations and demonstrated their mastery of combined arms warfare adapted to the unique challenges of conquering an island city. Spanish forces constructed 13 brigantines that enabled them to control the lake while preventing Aztec forces from receiving supplies or reinforcements from mainland territories. The final assault on Tenochtitlan combined European siege techniques with indigenous military support on an unprecedented scale. Spanish forces, supported by tens of thousands of indigenous allies from Tlaxcala and other tributary peoples, systematically destroyed Aztec defensive positions while advancing through the city street by street. The destruction of Tenochtitlan required 3 months of brutal fighting that killed tens of thousands of Aztec warriors and civilians while reducing one of the world's most magnificent cities to rubble. The fall of the Aztec capital in August 1521 marked the end of indigenous political independence in central Mexico and the beginning of Spanish colonial rule. The conquest of the Aztec Empire provided Spanish forces with unprecedented wealth, territorial control, and confidence that would drive their expansion throughout the Americas. But the greatest prize still lay to the south, a vast empire stretching along the Pacific coast of South America, where gold and silver were said to be more common than iron in Spain, and where a divine emperor ruled from a mountain city built with stones so perfectly fitted that a knife blade could not pass between them. Francisco Pizarro was coming, and the Inca Empire would never be the same. Francisco Pizarro's background epitomized the social dynamics that drove Spanish expansion in the Americas. Born around 1478 in Trujillo, Extremadura, he was the illegitimate son of Gonzalo Pizarro, a minor hidalgo, and Francisca Gonzalez, a woman of humble origins. His illegitimate birth barred him from inheriting his father's modest estate, while his lack of formal education limited his opportunities in Spanish society. Like many men of similar circumstances, Pizarro sought fortune in the Indies, arriving in Hispaniola around 1502 as part of the wave of settlers who followed Columbus's initial discoveries. Pizarro's participation in Vasco Núñez de Balboa's expedition across the Isthmus of Panama in 1513 provided him with his first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean and exposure to indigenous accounts of wealthy civilizations to the south. The expedition's discovery of the Pacific opened new possibilities for Spanish expansion while confirming indigenous reports of gold-rich territories beyond the mountains of Central America. The intelligence gathering that preceded Pizarro's first expedition to Peru revealed Spanish mastery of the information networks that connected indigenous communities across vast distances. Pizarro's first expedition to Peru, launched in November 1524 with approximately 80 men and 4 horses, demonstrated both Spanish determination and the inadequacy of their initial preparations for the challenges ahead. The initial reconnaissance revealed the formidable geographical obstacles that protected the Inca Empire from external invasion. The Pacific coastline south of Panama consisted of dense tropical forests, treacherous river crossings, and indigenous populations that had developed sophisticated defensive strategies against foreign intrusion. The Spanish discovery of Inca materials during their coastal reconnaissance provided the first tangible evidence of the advanced civilization they sought to conquer. Bartolomé Ruiz's capture of an Inca balsa raft revealed sophisticated textiles, gold ornaments, and silver vessels that demonstrated technological capabilities exceeding those of any indigenous American society Spanish forces had previously encountered. The raft's crew included skilled craftsmen who could work precious metals with techniques unknown in Europe, creating objects of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Pizarro's second expedition, launched in 1526 with approximately 160 men and several horses, benefited from improved financing and more sophisticated intelligence about Inca territories and capabilities. The Spanish penetration deeper into Inca territory during the second expedition revealed the extraordinary organizational capabilities of the empire they intended to conquer. Inca road systems impressed Spanish observers with their engineering sophistication and strategic importance for military communications and supply distribution. These roads, constructed with fitted stone blocks and equipped with bridges, drainage systems, and rest stations, connected administrative centers across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The Spanish discovery of the Inca Civil War between Huáscar and Atahualpa provided them with the political opportunity that had proven decisive in Mexican operations. The succession dispute that erupted following the death of Huayna Capac around 1527 had divided the empire into competing factions centered on Cusco and Quito, each claiming legitimate authority over Inca territories and subjects. The Civil War had devastated Inca military capabilities through years of internal fighting while creating political divisions that Spanish forces could exploit through selective alliances and diplomatic manipulation. Pizarro's return to Spain in 1528 to secure royal authorization for Inca conquest demonstrated his understanding that successful American expeditions required legal legitimacy as well as military capability. The capitulation signed with Charles V granted Pizarro the title of Governor and Captain General of Peru while authorizing him to conquer and colonize territories extending 200 leagues south of the Tumbes River. The third expedition that departed Panama in December 1530 represented the culmination of Spanish preparation for Inca conquest and demonstrated their mastery of the logistical requirements for major American operations. Everything was in place. The trap was set, and at a town called Cajamarca, fewer than 200 Spaniards would capture an emperor surrounded by thousands of warriors in one of the most audacious military operations in human history. The Spanish landing at Tumbes in 1532 revealed the devastating impact of civil war and disease on Inca military capabilities and population levels. The city that indigenous informants had described as a major administrative center with substantial fortifications and large populations showed clear evidence of recent warfare and demographic decline. Spanish observers noted abandoned buildings, damaged infrastructure, and significantly reduced populations that suggested the empire's internal conflicts had created vulnerabilities that foreign forces could exploit. The Spanish also encountered their first direct evidence of smallpox and other European diseases that had spread through indigenous trade networks ahead of actual European contact. The Spanish march inland toward Cajamarca demonstrated Pizarro's strategic understanding and his application of lessons learned from Cortés's Mexican operations. The route he selected provided access to Inca road networks while avoiding major population centers where large enemy forces might concentrate against his small expedition. Spanish forces moved in tight formations that maximized their defensive capabilities while maintaining flexibility for rapid deployment of cavalry and firearms. The expedition included indigenous interpreters recruited during coastal operations and Spanish soldiers experienced in American warfare. The Spanish arrival at Cajamarca on November 15, 1532, marked the beginning of the most audacious operation in the history of American conquest. The capture of an emperor surrounded by thousands of warriors by fewer than 200 foreign soldiers. Pizarro's deployment of his forces around the town's central plaza demonstrated his understanding of Spanish military advantages and Inca tactical limitations. Spanish horsemen concealed themselves in buildings surrounding the plaza, while crossbowmen and arquebusiers occupied elevated positions that provided clear fields of fire across the open space. Atahualpa's decision to enter Cajamarca with several thousand followers but without weapons reflected Inca diplomatic traditions and his confidence in his military superiority over the small Spanish force. Inca political protocol emphasized the sacred nature of imperial authority and the impossibility of harming the emperor without catastrophic supernatural consequences. Atahualpa's approach to the meeting demonstrated his understanding of Spanish technological capabilities, but his failure to recognize their tactical intentions or their willingness to violate diplomatic immunity. The Spanish attack at Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated European military tactics against indigenous forces unprepared for such warfare. The assault began when Spanish cavalry charged from concealed positions around the plaza while crossbowmen and arquebusiers opened fire from elevated positions. The psychological impact of the coordinated attack created panic among Inca forces who had never experienced simultaneous cavalry charges, firearm volleys, and artillery bombardment. Contemporary Spanish accounts describe Inca warriors trampling each other in their attempts to escape the plaza. The capture of Atahualpa during the Cajamarca assault eliminated the central authority that held the Inca Empire together while providing Spanish forces with unprecedented leverage over indigenous populations throughout the Andean region. Spanish soldiers seized the emperor during the confusion of the attack, preventing his escape while ensuring that resistance to Spanish authority would lack legitimate leadership. The psychological impact of the emperor's capture on Inca political structure cannot be overstated. Inca governmental theory held that imperial authority derived from divine mandate and that harm to the emperor would bring catastrophic consequences to the entire empire. The ransom negotiations that followed Atahualpa's capture revealed both Spanish greed and their sophisticated understanding of Inca political psychology. The emperor's offer to fill a room measuring 22 by 17 feet with gold objects reaching as high as a man could stretch demonstrated the vast wealth available within the empire, while providing Spanish forces with a mechanism for systematically stripping Inca temples, palaces, and administrative centers of their precious metal decorations. The systematic collection of Atahualpa's ransom provided Spanish forces with detailed knowledge of Inca administrative capabilities and the geographical extent of imperial control. But Pizarro had already decided the emperor's fate. No amount of gold could buy freedom, only a brief delay before the inevitable execution. The Inca Empire was about to fall. The execution of Atahualpa on July 26, 1533, eliminated the last legitimate source of imperial authority while demonstrating Spanish willingness to employ extreme measures to maintain control over conquered populations. Pizarro's decision to execute the emperor, despite receiving the promised ransom, reflected his understanding that Atahualpa's continued existence would provide a focus for indigenous resistance, while his death would create political chaos that Spanish forces could exploit. The execution also served as a warning to other indigenous leaders about the consequences of opposing Spanish authority. The Spanish march to Cusco following Atahualpa's execution demonstrated their mastery of Inca transportation networks and their ability to maintain military momentum despite operating in unfamiliar territory thousands of miles from Spanish bases. The expedition that departed Cajamarca in August 1533 included Spanish soldiers, indigenous allies recruited from anti-Inca populations, and Inca administrators who provided essential knowledge of road systems, supply stations, and political conditions in territories they would traverse. The Spanish approach to Cusco revealed both the opportunities and challenges inherent in conquering a sophisticated urban civilization with limited European manpower. The imperial capital covered several square miles of terraced hillsides, connected by stone-paved streets and dominated by massive fortress walls constructed with precisely fitted stone blocks. The city's population exceeded 100,000 inhabitants, organized into kinship groups that combined residential, occupational, and religious functions. Spanish observers noted the city's architectural sophistication, its elaborate water supply systems, and the massive temple complexes that dominated the urban landscape. The Spanish occupation of Cusco in November 1533 provided them with control over the symbolic and administrative center of the Inca Empire while demonstrating their ability to govern complex urban populations through manipulation of existing political structures. Spanish forces established their headquarters in imperial palaces while distributing encomienda grants that provided Spanish colonists with rights to indigenous labor and tribute. The occupation also revealed the vast wealth accumulated in Inca temples and administrative buildings, including gold and silver objects that exceeded even Spanish expectations based on Atahualpa's ransom. The rebellion of Manco Inca in 1536 revealed the limitations of Spanish control over indigenous populations and the continued vitality of Inca political traditions despite the destruction of the imperial governmental structure. Manco, a younger brother of Huáscar, whom Spanish forces had installed as a puppet ruler, organized a coordinated uprising that demonstrated sophisticated military planning and widespread indigenous support for resistance to Spanish authority. The rebellion began with simultaneous attacks on Spanish positions throughout the former empire, while Inca forces implemented siege tactics that trapped Spanish colonists in urban centers. The siege of Cusco that began in May 1536 represented the most serious challenge to Spanish colonial authority since the conquest of Tenochtitlan and demonstrated indigenous ability to adapt their military tactics to Spanish weapons and defensive positions. Manco's forces numbered in the tens of thousands and included warriors from throughout the former empire who had maintained their military organization despite Spanish attempts to disarm indigenous populations. Spanish survival during the siege depended on their superior defensive capabilities, their access to indigenous allies who opposed Inca authority, and their ability to maintain communication with other Spanish settlements. Manco Inca's retreat to Vilcabamba following the failure of the Cusco siege marked the beginning of a neo-Inca state that would challenge Spanish authority for more than 3 decades while providing a focus for indigenous resistance throughout the colonial period. The mountainous region northwest of Cusco provided ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare, while its isolation from major Spanish population centers limited colonial military responses to indigenous resistance. Manco established governmental institutions that maintained Inca political traditions while adapting to the realities of operating as a resistance movement rather than a territorial empire. The conquest phase was over, but the story of the conquistadors was far from finished. New expeditions were launching into unknown territories, searching for golden cities and wealthy kingdoms that existed only in Spanish imagination. Expeditions that would reveal the true scale of the Americas and the limits of Spanish ambition. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's appointment as governor of Nueva Galicia in 1538 positioned him perfectly to investigate the most persistent and detailed reports of northern wealth that had reached Spanish colonial authorities. Fray Marcos de Niza's reconnaissance expedition in 1539 had returned with accounts of Cibola, described as 7 cities of extraordinary wealth located somewhere in the vast territories north of established Spanish settlements. These accounts resonated powerfully with Spanish officials familiar with the pattern of discovery that had led to the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires. Coronado's expedition departed Compostela on February 23, 1540, with a force that represented one of the largest and best-equipped Spanish expeditions ever assembled for American exploration. The expedition included approximately 300 Spanish soldiers, 1,000 indigenous allies recruited from Mexican settlements, and 1,500 horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs that would provide transportation, food, and the foundation for permanent settlements in conquered territories. The Spanish contingent included 230 horsemen mounted on carefully selected animals bred for endurance in difficult terrain. The indigenous allies who accompanied Coronado's expedition represented a crucial component of Spanish exploration capabilities that often receives insufficient attention in traditional conquest narratives. These men, drawn from Tlaxcalan, Tarascan, and other Mexican communities that had allied with Spanish forces during earlier conquests, brought essential skills including knowledge of indigenous languages, familiarity with American geographical conditions, and combat experience against diverse indigenous opponents. Many served as interpreters who could facilitate communication with unknown populations. The Spanish advance northward through Sinaloa and Sonora revealed geographical challenges that exceeded anything conquistadors had previously encountered in their American operations. The Sonoran Desert presented Spanish forces with extreme temperatures, limited water sources, and terrain that tested the endurance of both men and animals accustomed to more hospitable environments. Spanish horses bred for European and Caribbean conditions struggled with the heat and scarcity of adequate forage, while Spanish soldiers discovered that their steel armor became unbearably hot during daytime marches. Coronado's arrival at the Zuni pueblo of Hawiku in July 1540 marked the culmination of months of anticipation and the beginning of profound Spanish disillusionment with the reality of the 7 cities of gold. The pueblo, constructed of adobe and stone blocks, housed approximately 1,000 inhabitants in multi-story buildings that demonstrated sophisticated architectural techniques but contained none of the precious metals that Spanish forces had expected to discover. Spanish soldiers found well-organized communities with extensive agricultural systems, sophisticated pottery, and complex religious practices, but the wealth that had motivated their arduous journey simply did not exist. Spanish exploration of the broader Pueblo region during the summer and fall of 1540 revealed a complex network of agricultural communities that had developed sophisticated systems for surviving in arid environments but possessed limited quantities of the precious metals that motivated Spanish expansion. The expedition visited numerous pueblos scattered across present-day New Mexico and Arizona, finding communities with populations ranging from a few hundred to several thousand inhabitants. These settlements demonstrated remarkable architectural achievements, including multi-story buildings, elaborate ceremonial structures, and defensive walls constructed with precisely fitted stone blocks. The Spanish search for additional wealth led to the dispatch of smaller expeditions that explored territories far beyond the main force's base of operations, demonstrating the systematic approach that characterized Spanish exploration techniques. Garcia Lopez de Cardenas led a detachment westward that became the first European expedition to observe the Grand Canyon, while Hernando de Alvarado explored eastward into the Great Plains, where Spanish forces encountered nomadic buffalo hunting peoples with cultural practices entirely different from the agricultural communities they had previously observed. The golden cities were a mirage, but Spanish ambition was far from exhausted, and other expeditions were pushing into the unknown, searching for wealth that would forever elude them. Hernando de Soto's expedition through the southeastern United States, beginning in 1539, was demonstrating that the pattern of disappointment experienced in the north extended to other regions that Spanish forces had hoped would yield the wealth and populations necessary for successful colonial development. De Soto's background as a veteran of Pizarro's Peruvian operations and his success in accumulating personal wealth through Inca conquest made him an ideal candidate to lead Spanish exploration of the North American Southeast, where indigenous reports suggested the existence of wealthy kingdoms and dense populations. De Soto's expedition departed Havana on May 18, 1539, with approximately 620 men, representing one of the largest and most thoroughly equipped Spanish forces ever assembled for North American exploration. The expedition included 223 horsemen mounted on animals specifically selected for their endurance and combat effectiveness in unknown terrain, while the remaining soldiers carried crossbows, arquebuses, steel swords, and armor manufactured according to specifications developed through decades of American conquest experience. The Spanish landing at Tampa Bay in May 1539 marked the beginning of systematic exploration that would reveal both the complexity of southeastern indigenous societies and the limited opportunities they offered for Spanish colonial exploitation. The indigenous populations that De Soto's expedition encountered demonstrated remarkable diversity in their political organization, technological capabilities, and responses to Spanish arrival. The expedition encountered chiefdoms with sophisticated agricultural systems, complex social hierarchies, and territorial control extending across multiple communities. The Battle of Mabila in October 1540 marked the most significant military confrontation of De Soto's expedition and revealed both Spanish tactical capabilities and the formidable resistance that southeastern indigenous peoples could organize when properly motivated and led. The Choctaw chief Tuscaloosa had organized a coordinated ambush involving thousands of warriors concealed within a fortified town, demonstrating indigenous ability to adapt their military tactics to Spanish weapons and fighting techniques. The battle resulted in the destruction of most Spanish equipment and supplies while inflicting casualties that significantly weakened the expedition's combat effectiveness. The Spanish discovery of the Mississippi River in May 1541 represented the most significant geographical achievement of De Soto's expedition and provided European cartographers with crucial information about North American river systems. The river's enormous size and volume impressed Spanish observers who recognized its potential as a transportation route connecting vast interior territories with coastal regions. De Soto's death from fever in May 1542 eliminated the expedition's primary leadership while creating a succession crisis that revealed the limitations of Spanish command structures during extended operations far from colonial bases. Meanwhile, Francisco de Orellana's navigation of the Amazon River during 1541-1542 represented the most ambitious exploration of South American interior territories ever undertaken by Spanish forces and revealed both the vast scale of Amazonian river systems and the sophisticated indigenous societies that inhabited these regions. Orellana's expedition began as a reconnaissance mission from Gonzalo Pizarro's search for El Dorado and the land of cinnamon, but evolved into an independent exploration that would provide European geographers with their first comprehensive information about the Amazon basin and its indigenous inhabitants. The failure of these massive expeditions to discover additional sources of wealth comparable to the Aztec and Inca empires marked a crucial turning point in Spanish colonial policy and the end of the era of great territorial conquests. Spanish colonial authorities recognized that the easily accessible wealth of American civilizations had been largely exhausted, and that future colonial development would require different strategies based on agricultural production, mining operations in known deposits, and the systematic exploitation of indigenous labor through established encomienda systems rather than the dramatic territorial seizures that had characterized the first half-century of Spanish expansion. The age of the conquistador was ending, but their legacy would endure for centuries, a legacy written in blood, gold, and the ashes of civilizations that would never rise again. The evolution of Spanish military tactics during the conquest period reflected a sophisticated understanding of how European technological advantages could be maximized against indigenous opponents while minimizing Spanish vulnerabilities in unfamiliar environments. Spanish commanders had learned through bitter experience that their small numbers made conventional European battle formations suicidal against indigenous armies that could field thousands of warriors. Instead, they developed combined arms tactics that coordinated cavalry charges with crossbow volleys and arquebus fire, creating a deadly synergy that could shatter indigenous formations while maintaining Spanish unit cohesion. The Spanish warhorse represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapon in the conquistador arsenal, but its effectiveness depended on careful selection, training, and tactical employment that reflected decades of American combat experience. Spanish cavalry mounts averaged 14 to 15 hands in height and weighed between 800 and 1,000 pounds, dimensions that provided the mass necessary for effective shock combat while maintaining the agility required for rapid maneuvering in difficult terrain. These animals descended from Andalusian and Barb stock, specifically bred for endurance in hot climates. Spanish crossbow technology had reached its peak during the late medieval period, producing weapons that combined mechanical precision with devastating penetrating power against indigenous armor and shields. Spanish crossbowmen carried steel prods with draw weights exceeding 600 pounds, generating projectile velocities that could penetrate cotton armor at ranges up to 250 yards. The crossbow's mechanical advantage meant that soldiers with minimal training could achieve accuracy levels that would require years to develop with traditional bows. Spanish firearms technology, while primitive by later standards, provided conquistadors with psychological advantages that far exceeded their practical military effectiveness. The matchlock arquebuses carried by Spanish soldiers produced thunderous noise, dense smoke, and devastating wounds that convinced many indigenous peoples that Spanish forces possessed supernatural powers. These weapons measured approximately 4 feet in length, weighed 15 to 20 pounds, and required forked rests for accurate shooting, making them cumbersome but psychologically effective tools of warfare. The systematic employment of war dogs represented one of the most controversial and effective aspects of Spanish military innovation, combining psychological warfare with practical tracking capabilities that proved devastating against indigenous populations. Spanish forces employed mastiffs and greyhounds specifically trained to attack indigenous peoples, with individual animals capable of tracking fleeing warriors through dense vegetation, while their savage attacks demoralized indigenous communities. These dogs could distinguish between Spanish and indigenous scents, making them valuable for night operations and the pursuit of scattered enemy forces. The recruitment and management of indigenous allies represented perhaps the most crucial element of Spanish conquest strategy, transforming small European expeditions into formidable military coalitions capable of toppling vast American empires. Spanish commanders understood that their numerical inferiority made indigenous collaboration essential for military success. But they also recognized that indigenous political divisions provided opportunities for manipulation that could turn American peoples against each other while advancing Spanish territorial objectives. Spanish psychological warfare techniques exploited indigenous cultural assumptions and religious beliefs to create terror and demoralization that far exceeded the actual military threat posed by small European forces. Spanish commanders understood that indigenous peoples often interpreted European arrival through religious or mythological frameworks that could be manipulated to Spanish advantage. They deliberately cultivated reputations for supernatural power through carefully staged demonstrations of European technology, while their willingness to violate indigenous diplomatic and religious protocols demonstrated their contempt for American cultural limitations. The conquistadors had perfected a terrible science, the systematic destruction of entire civilizations using a handful of men, horses, and steel. But what came after conquest? The systematic destruction of the Inca Empire had filled Spanish colonial coffers with unprecedented wealth while simultaneously fueling insatiable appetites for even greater treasures that surely lay hidden in the vast unexplored territories of the Americas. The establishment of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535 and the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542 created administrative frameworks that centralized colonial government under royal appointees who possessed extensive authority over territorial administration, economic policy, and indigenous affairs. These viceroys served as direct representatives of the Spanish crown with powers that exceeded those of most European governors. The encomienda system that emerged during these early years of colonization became the primary mechanism for indigenous exploitation and the foundation of colonial society. The encomienda granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and labor from indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and religious instruction. This system drew directly on precedents established during the Reconquista, when Christian lords had been granted similar rights over Muslim populations. In practice, the encomienda created conditions that differed little from slavery. The demographic catastrophe that befell indigenous American populations following European contact represents one of the most severe population collapses in recorded human history, with mortality rates in some regions approaching 90% within a century of initial Spanish arrival. The primary agent of this devastation was not Spanish weapons or military tactics, but rather the introduction of old-world diseases against which indigenous populations had no biological defenses: smallpox, typhus, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, and other pathogens. Smallpox proved particularly devastating to indigenous populations because of its combination of high mortality rates, efficient transmission methods, and the complete absence of natural immunity among American peoples. The disease typically killed 30% of infected individuals in populations with previous exposure, but mortality rates among indigenous Americans often exceeded 90% during initial outbreaks. The virus spread rapidly through indigenous communities via respiratory droplets and contaminated materials, enabling single infected individuals to trigger epidemics that could devastate entire regions. The forced labor systems that Spanish colonial authorities implemented throughout their American territories created exploitative relationships that reduced indigenous populations to conditions approaching slavery while providing Spanish colonists with the labor necessary for mining operations, agricultural development, and construction projects. The métier system implemented in the Andean regions represented the most systematic and devastating form of forced indigenous labor, requiring communities to provide workers for the silver mines of Potosí and other mining centers according to quotas that often condemned participants to death from exposure, exhaustion, and mercury poisoning. The working conditions in colonial silver mines represented some of the most dangerous and unhealthy environments ever created by human economic activity, combining exposure to toxic mercury vapors with physical demands that exceeded human endurance and safety standards that prioritized production over worker welfare. Indigenous miners worked in underground tunnels that lacked adequate ventilation, proper support structures, and emergency exits, while their exposure to mercury used in silver processing caused neurological damage, respiratory problems, and premature death. Despite the systematic destruction of their traditional societies and the implementation of exploitative labor systems, indigenous peoples throughout Spanish America developed sophisticated strategies for cultural resistance and survival that preserved essential elements of their heritage while adapting to colonial conditions. Cultural syncretism, the blending of indigenous and Spanish religious practices, enabled native communities to maintain their traditional spiritual beliefs within the framework of imposed Christian observance while creating new forms of religious expression that satisfied Spanish authorities while preserving indigenous cultural identity. The conquistadors had conquered with steel and horses, but the true conquest, the conquest of souls, the erasure of memory, the destruction of entire ways of life, that conquest would take centuries, and it would never be complete. The rise of the Creole class during the mid-16th century created new social dynamics within Spanish colonial society that would fundamentally reshape relationships between European-born colonists, American-born Spanish descendants, indigenous populations, and mixed-race communities. Creoles, Spanish colonists born in the Americas, developed cultural identities and economic interests that differed significantly from those of peninsular Spaniards while maintaining claims to European social status and political privileges. Their emergence as a distinct social group reflected the maturation of colonial society and the development of American-born elites. The creation of mestizo societies throughout Spanish America represented one of the most significant long-term consequences of conquest that distinguished Spanish colonial development from other European colonial systems. The systematic intermarriage between Spanish colonists and indigenous women created large populations of mixed-race individuals who possessed cultural knowledge and social connections that enabled them to function effectively within both Spanish and indigenous communities. These mestizo populations became crucial intermediaries in colonial society. The establishment of racial hierarchies based on biological ancestry represented a fundamental innovation in human social organization that would influence colonial and post-colonial societies throughout the Americas for centuries. Spanish colonial administrators developed detailed taxonomies that classified individuals according to their alleged racial composition, creating legal categories that determined access to education, religious positions, governmental offices, and economic opportunities. These systems institutionalized racial discrimination while providing mechanisms for limited social mobility. The economic transformation of Spanish colonial territories during the late 16th century reflected the maturation of colonial society and the development of sophisticated economic systems that connected American production with global markets through increasingly complex networks of exchange and investment. The discovery of massive silver deposits at Potosi in 1545 created unprecedented opportunities for wealth accumulation that attracted investment capital from throughout Europe, while generating the monetary resources necessary for financing global trade networks that connected the Americas with Asia and Africa. The hacienda system that emerged throughout Spanish colonial territories during the late 16th century represented a new form of agricultural organization that combined Spanish land tenure concepts with American environmental conditions and indigenous labor systems. These large estates, typically covering thousands of acres, produced agricultural products for both local consumption and export markets while employing various forms of labor, including wage workers, debt peons, and enslaved Africans. The transatlantic trade networks that connected Spanish colonial territories with European and African markets created economic relationships that integrated American production with global commercial systems while generating enormous wealth for Spanish merchants and colonial administrators. Spanish colonial exports included not only precious metals, but also agricultural products such as sugar, tobacco, and cacao, that found ready markets in European cities where demand for exotic American commodities continued to expand throughout the 16th century. The last phase of conquistador activity during the late 16th century occurred in peripheral regions where Spanish colonial authority remained incomplete and where indigenous populations continued to maintain political independence through military resistance or geographical isolation. The conquest of Chile, which began with Pedro de Valdivia's expedition in 1540 and continued for more than 2 centuries against Mapuche resistance, represented the longest and most difficult military campaign in Spanish colonial history. The Mapuche people had developed sophisticated military techniques that enabled them to resist Spanish expansion while maintaining political independence over substantial territories in southern Chile. The age of the great conquests was over, but the conquistador legacy, written in blood and gold, in destroyed civilizations and new hybrid cultures, would shape the Americas for centuries to come. This is the eternal flow of history,